We are back and we are getting towards the very end. So this slide, or the set of slides, is going to talk about support for evolution. So why do we have our basis for why we think that the theory of evolution is true? So you've seen this image before. It's the tree of life. So with the theory of evolution saying that all species present on Earth are descendants of a seeming single common ancestor. We had a universal ancestor, probably that very first prokaryotic life on Earth. And then as time has changed, we saw more and more changes. So then we start to see where we have the eubacteria, or true bacteria. And then currently we call our archaebacteria. And then changes happen in our protistocytes. So we start to get to our eukaryotic cells. Now there are certain things why all of us are related. We share certain characteristics that I'll talk about towards the end. Basically, it all boils down to natural selection and speciation. So how do new species form? There's all kinds of different reasons why this might happen. It can be due to environment, behavior, just how the chromosomes align, and there's several causes. Speciation is when we get one or more species from an ancestral form. And this is the macroevolution that people have a hard time, or the non-biologists have a hard time accepting. Now, there's different ways these causes. We can have natural selection, where we select for certain traits. And it could be due to continental drift, or changes in environments, mutations, or even man can lead to new species being formed. So continental drift is one of them. And one reason that we have support for this is with our fossil records. So with our fossil records, we're seeing that there's fossils present of similar fossils present in the different continents that are now separated by wide oceans. So if you remember what this original mass was called, which is Pangea, eventually it was one huge landmass, and then we have the tectonic plates. Probably said that wrong. They're constantly changing and moving, and I like to watch those videos of how Earth might look in the future, because everything is still slowly moving, and it's kind of interesting. They kind of propose maybe everything will get back together at one point in time. Now, in order to form fossils, you have to have the perfect conditions. That's why we have an incomplete fossil record. Now, in order to be considered a fossil, it has to be over 10,000 years old. And we have it from all different major groups of organisms. And depending on where you fall in to the different levels, determine how old you are. Now, there's different ways that we can test it. We could test the relative age by where it falls in the different rock levels, that's superposition. Or we can actually do the isotope, where we do the radiometric measures and measure the absolute age of it. Now, when it comes to this, as I mentioned, we do have we do not have a complete record. We are missing things because it takes the perfect conditions for fossils to form. What the fossils do tell us is some of the physical evidence. It shows us what it looked like. It might kind of give us like, okay, this is what the internal structure cavity might have been, but we don't get to see like the organization and all that stuff. As I mentioned, we only have the fossils for about 1% of all species believed to live on Earth that we possibly have identified. There's so much that's probably come and died off before we even identified or seen them, and maybe we'll actually discover them later on. Now, depending on the type of organism, they might not leave because they probably decompose pretty rapidly. There's different types. We can have them where they're encased in resin, so you think of the mosquito in Jurassic Park. It could be where the organic material or the matter is replaced by minerals and turned to bone. Impressions left after organism decays, are cast in footprints, are filled with mud and turned into stone. So there's all kinds of different fossils. It's one of those things that people get fascinated by, especially dinosaur fossils. Now, the environment can affect evolution. So sometimes like barriers can happen and it will lead to separation of species. And what that happens is it blocks off exchange of the gene pool. And eventually, depending on how that barrier hits, will lead to certain traits being left on one side and other traits being on the other. And then the environment can also be different between that isolation. This can be caused by randomness or by natural disasters. And like this little cartoon is like, okay, here's this river, but if you really want to keep the species going, you'd swim across. So pictorially, here's the original population. We had a barrier come that split the population in half, just randomly split in half. And then that led to reproductive isolation. So maybe the river's too deep, they can't go across. So now this population's only reproducing with itself and this one. Due to selection and changes in specific mutations, we now go from one species to two. I've talked about man, how we can drive this, and this is through artificial selection. So I talked about all the different vegetables that we get from wild mustard when I talked about how man is all through selective breeding. We're not introducing new genes, we're not making transgenic organisms, we are just selecting what we want to do. Same thing with dogs. This is dog Vader right here. I'm pretty sure, his ancestors, the wolf, didn't know at one point in time that people were going to dress him up in Halloween costumes. And he did win that year at the contest he went to. He was the most scary. Now, nature does have a way to kind of prevent new species from forming. So sometimes you want them to form, but sometimes you don't. So this is where we're going to have these mechanisms of reproductive isolation. And we're going to have it at two different levels. There's going to be at the prezygotic and then the postzygotic barrier. Now, inbreeding happens, but there's a way to make sure that it doesn't happen. So when two species try to interbreed, they won't make a fertile offspring, but sometimes it does. Example is when we make mules. So let's talk about the prezygotic ones, and there's different ones. Now, this is going to prevent the different species from mating to produce a zygote. Maybe their chromosome number is close enough to where they could, but what we're doing is preventing that from happening. So one way is where we have habitat isolation, where they might prefer different habitats and there's unlikely they're ever going to encounter each other. One might like the cold, might like the hot. So those two totally different ones will kind of prevent them from crossing paths. It could be where we have temporal isolation, where they produce at different times of the day or the year, and it's unlikely when it's mating season for one, it's not going to be for the other one. So like this little cartoon right here, this guy's ready to release the pollen, and this guy's like, no, maybe wait till spring to do that. This guy does it in the fall. It can also be behavioral. So species might have courtship behaviors or preferences that they look for. So what might be attractive for one species might be unattractive in the other one. So just like this little cartoon right here. So when you watch the video with the little bird dance, it might work for the birds of paradise, but maybe for a different species of bird, not so much. Now, what happens if two species, they actually do come together? It might happen to where the egg and sperm can't combine in fertilization, even if they meet up their mating. So this is like the cat and the dog humping. This is gametic isolation. It has to do with the various differences in the number of chromosomes, and then, it comes together and the cell just realizes things are wrong and it's itself. And then, there are also mechanical isolations. So there are changes in the reproductive structures that actually make them impossible to try to get to this part where they actually do the part of the egg and sperm possibly meeting. This will be changes in the different shapes and sizes of the penises or the vaginas of the different animals. Now, if it does happen, it does make it to the zygote. We get to what's called the post-zygotic barrier. And basically, this is going to prevent us from getting to the healthy, fertile adults. Most of the time, if it does happen, they're going to be sterile. As I mentioned, this is a good example with the mules. So a horse and a donkey, they're only separated by like one pair of chromosomes. But it's due to that mismatch, it creates a problem when it comes to meiosis, and mules are unable to reproduce because they can't make the gametes. It all has to do with the chromosomes lining up. Now, there's different reasons we have evidence for evolution, and here are a few. I kind of mentioned the fossil record already. We're going to talk a little bit about similarities in body structure. So just looking at the shape of the skulls between different primate and non-human primate species. Similarities in early development. So we share a lot of similar genes called our Hox genes. The presence of vestigial structure and how much DNA we actually share with other organisms. So with body structure, the term homologous structures is going to show up right here. So if two organisms have body structures that are similar, they must have a common ancestor. So it might physically look different, but the overall layout is very similar. You're going to say have the same configuration and development. And there might be differences in modification to adapt to the environment, might alter like how it is. So we have the human, dog, bird, and whale armed shown right here. So think about the different environments they live in. So a whale is going to be in the aquatic environment, so they're going to have those fins. So the fingers or the phalanges are going to be a lot longer for the fin bones, but they're not going to need the super long bones in the arm because the fins are closer to the body. If you think about a bird, they don't need the multiple fingers, but they do need those bones to make the wings. And then the human and the dog. Think about how our hands are laid out and how the dog paw is different, depending on, they walk on all fours and we walk on two. But if you look at this, you still see the same basic pattern of the bones. It's just the length and how they're organized might be a little different to adjust to different environments. Now, vestigial structures are structures that are kept around that no longer have use, but they just were never got rid of. Dew claws and dogs are a prime examples. So it was thought that ancestral dogs might have had 5 toes on 1 foot, and the dew claw is a residual of that 5th toe. Their function is they have no point to there. When in humans is when we're going through development with tail, and through apoptosis that tail is reduced, and we might have some little tail bones, but sometimes there might be a little trace of the tail extending for people. Sometimes people are born with a little tail. It's just because of that failed apoptosis. But sometimes structures are kept around that have no point or purpose at all. Development is another key one. So as I mentioned when we talked about model organisms, we share a lot of similar genes. And there are these genes called these homeotic genes or Hox genes, and they're located on your different chromosomes, and they occur in a specific order. Now, these are really specific because these genes have to go and be turned on in certain order during development. So an example that we figured out why this is by using our friend the fruit fly. And what we did was we took a gene, maybe that was a gene that codes for the leg formation. And if we physically move it up here to where it's head formation, we can get it to where we can get a leg develop in place of an antenna. It's really cool. Now, when we sequence these genes, we see a lot of similarities between the fruit fly and even the mouse and the human, suggesting, that common ancestor that we kind of go through and share them. Now, also, if you were to look at a bunch of embryos at the different stages, you can see there's a lot of similarities in how they look and resemble each other week after week, and eventually things change a little bit. So this is a video that kind of talks about that a little bit. It's really cool. And then finally, so our similarities in DNA. Now, we do share a lot of the same DNA with a lot of things. That's why a lot of these model organisms are present. Simple as a plant, 18%, yeast, the fruit fly, the mouse, 92%. That's why it is like a huge component for a lot of research for humans. And then the chimp, 98%. So this is where people like, oh, I'm not like an ape and all that stuff, but we do share 98% of the same DNA with them. Now, what's kind of interesting is we have all this, and people are still won't accept it. So there are some things that we can see in humans that show up in other species that are kind of support this. This is a little video there, kind of talking about goosebumps and are when infants are super strong and with their fingers when they're early on. It has to do with one of our links to our ancestors in the non-human primates. And finally, what happens if a species ends? This is pretty much extinction. So if the environment change is too rapid and we can't adapt to that, it's going to lead to enough mutations that can't adapt to it, and the species are going to die. This can be due to, like I was talking about, the founder effect, their genetic drift, or it's just a mass thing that just kills off a lot of the species. So we can influence evolution in different ways. I need to read this book. So we've gone through 5 mass extinctions so far, and it's proposed that we're possibly entering to the 6th one. And the reason we're supporting this is we're seeing a certain number of species die off every year, and there's different conditions that you meet to be considered extinct. And there's like the endangered, there's all the different levels. Now, there are natural ways, thanks to climate change, is what we're seeing, are the huge major events. I think climate change should fall more into the human activities because a lot of our activities are influencing natural stuff, but the climate does change on its own too. But humans done a lot of this through our using their habitats. We keep taking it, and it seems like all the time we're building more and more houses, and eventually there's going to be no just regular natural land available. When we do these introduction exotic invasive species, one thing that showed up on the news a lot was people getting these unknown packets of seeds from China. Well, some of those have been shown to be invasive species for this area, so that's a whole controversy thing. But you've seen this happen to certain species like pythons in Florida, how they're released and how they kind of taken over the natural environment. Pollution, our commercial harvesting, all these different things have led to us influencing other species to be able to survive. So I'm going to stop it right there. I didn't see that I didn't put any videos for evolution for review. It's at the end of the semester, but if you have any questions, let me know. So I'm going to stop this one right here.